welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 257. The show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/257. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Kelley Vlahos. Kelley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. So this is your first time on the show. I just would like to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience if they're not aware of who you are.
Sure. So I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, but my primary job is editor of the Responsible Statecraft magazine, which is the online magazine of the Quincy Institute. And so most of my day, every day, is filled with putting up stories about U.S. foreign policy, but specifically U.S. foreign policy through an alternative, heterodox, dissenting view or lens than what most people read from the establishment media on foreign policy.
And so I was going through your bio just a little bit here at Quincy, and I know you spent some time at the American Conservative magazine. And then what did you have some experience with Fox News too?
Yes. So I was affiliated with Fox News, foxnews.com, as a political reporter since before 9/11. So I actually got on board in June 2001 and stayed with them, on and off. I mean, I was always affiliated, but I started off full time, had my two children, and then ended up like just freelancing for them all the way through, I would say probably 2015, 2014. And in that time, I started writing for the American Conservative because at the time they were really the only conservative magazine that had taken a hard position against the Iraq War and against U.S. foreign policy post 9/11 in general, the Patriot Act, the other wars that had been initiated in the global war on terror. And so it was a really good outlet for me as somebody who was working for establishment, albeit conservative media, but had, as you know, been towing the line and supporting the Bush administration throughout the war. So very proud of that affiliation. And then I went to work there full time in 2017 as their managing and then executive editor
And
to the Quincy Institute.
And through that time too, you were a columnist, at least submitting articles to antiwar.com.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, excellent. And I wanted to ask you too. So what first kind of got you interested in foreign policy?
Absolutely. I'm a journalist by trade. So after leaving college in the 90s, I went right into working for newspapers and, being a general news reporter. I mean, just got all of my skills and started, paying my dues, so to speak, just doing general news reporting, local news and state news. And it came down to Washington. I'm very much interested in politics, but always had a specific interest in covering foreign policy as it affects the American people. I think that came from a real passion and an emotional interest in the Vietnam War and Vietnam veterans and how they were treated when they came back from the war, and how that continued to affect mental health and other health impacts of war all the way through the first Persian Gulf War, which is my generation. Sadly found that many of the problems, the poor preparation and the response to troops coming home with mysterious illnesses from that war had the same echoes as the way Vietnam veterans were treated when they had health problems and mental health issues when they came home. And so I got more and more involved in covering Washington policy as it was affecting not only the veterans, but also the policies that were sending men and women overseas. And so I think that's kind of where the kernel of my interest in foreign policy began. And now I find myself an editor who is covering all facets of foreign policy, all regions of the world. And I'm very lucky because I'm, every day I'm reading and editing and showcasing editors, I mean, experts in regions all over the world geopolitically, but through the lens of realism and restraint, which I find had really been missing in our establishment media and the discourse online. Really, I mean, as you know, dissenting views get crowded out and silenced all the time. And so I'm very proud to be part of a magazine now that highlights people who are writing in a different way with alternative ideas about our role in the world, um, our interventions, the treatment of our soldiers and the veterans when they come home. It's all part of a holistic way of looking at, what has failed in the past and maybe how we can do things differently in the future. And the Ukraine war has just sort of brought so many of these issues to light. I mean, short of having U.S. troops there en masse on the ground, we are reliving a lot of the foreign policy mistakes of the past in terms of our proxy wars and our interventions and sending millions, not billions of dollars worth of weapons into a battle zone and not knowing where they're going and what's going to happen to them. So really reliving history here in real time. And I'm just happy that there are people like yourself and others who are actually, getting a platform now.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's kind of seems like a privilege to be living in this time where we have the opportunity at least to confront these ideas and try to prevent reliving the past and committing those same mistakes. But it also makes you wonder how uniform opinion was really. I mean, I think the entire American mythos starts with World War II, it really seems like, at least for my generation. But it makes you go back and at least kind of wonder what it was like actually living through those times and if opinion really was that uniform. I mean, obviously after, Pearl Harbor happened, it seemed people were mostly on board, but it kind of makes you question it because there is, I think, populist opposition in the United States to this proxy war that's going on now. And what was it like on, just for regular people during different wars? I mean, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And I have a friend who's written a couple times for Responsible Statecraft. His name is Brandon Buck, and he is a PhD candidate at George Mason University. And he's doing a lot of work on the history of the anti-war movement on the right. And in his research, he's really found a plethora of information about the propaganda that had been deployed during World War I and later in World War II. And it is absolutely outrageous because the government had so much more access and control over the medium and the pathways to information. And we didn't have the internet, we didn't have television, and it was just so much easier for the government to just deploy propagandists all over. And control even the post office and the information people were getting in their mailboxes. And so obviously this is not new, that the government is trying to manipulate and manage the message of war. I just think that today with the internet and so many other ways of accessing information, there are much more opportunities for an anti-war movement to flourish. That said, I really worry about all of these efforts by the elite media in concert with the government and corporations to unleash this idea of minding information through the prism of disinformation or misinformation or malinformation as a way to manage the message. And what they're doing is they're canceling, silencing, speech all over the internet in the name of this disinformation regime. And I don't know if it'll ultimately work because there are great people that are exposing this, like, Matt Taibbi and Ken Klippenstein at The Intercept. They're doing like yeoman's work and exposing all this cottage industry of disinformation minders But it remains to be seen on how effective they will be in chilling speech, because I see that just as an updated version of all the awful things they did during World War I to keep everybody on the same page and supporting war.
And it really makes me wonder, I mean, at this point in time, it really has been an information war, at least on the home front, when it comes to Ukraine and these other things. But it really makes me wonder and fear what would happen. I mean, of course, militarily, if things were to become a direct war between Russia and NATO, but what would it be like on the home front? I mean, if we were to survive long enough to actually have a behind the scenes, conversation, if speech would just directly be made illegal. I mean, we were already seeing, I think, Dave in his in anti-war news the other day, he had a story about how, I think it was Aaron Mate he discovered that Twitter, at the behest of the FBI, who at the behest of Ukrainian intelligence was censoring people, or the FBI had requested that Twitter censor people. And I mean, seems like a direct First Amendment viewpoint violation at the behest of a foreign government.
Oh, it's really disturbing, and I don't know how far it goes. I feel every day I open my news, alternative news, and see another outrage like that exposed. And because this war has been so vaunted and feted by the foreign policy establishment and the elite media, they turn a blind eye to that. Though we spent several years talking about Russian meddling and disinformation and manipulation of our politics and our elections, but yet we have indications that the Ukraine might be meddling in how the United States people see their war, and it's completely ignored by the mainstream. So we have to be vigilant. Whatever you think of Tucker Carlson or RFK Jr., I mean, these are two guys, one on the right, one on the left, who are broadcasting this message every day. Now that Tucker has started his show on Twitter, he put out another episode this week, 2 episodes so far. And one of the overriding messages is that, we're being lied to, and we have to keep our eyes open and our ears open and not believe everything that we see. RFK Jr., the same thing. I heard him talking the other day about the war in Ukraine, and he's right. We're not getting all of the information, and we're not getting enough information about the war as the American people to decide whether or not it's in our best interest to give $100 billion to this country in weapons and aid. Another aid package is expected by the end of the summer. And it's all about information and having access to information so that we can decide what's best for our country. And we're not getting that. And I'm glad that there are populists on both the left and the right who are banging this drum and who have huge audiences. Whether you like them or not, they are reaching people. And I think cable news and I think the elite legacy media are a little nervous right now because they do have more reach day after day than the ratings that the news on television and newspapers are getting. So I guess we'll see. It's an ongoing battle for the information.
And it seems to, so the general narrative is the democracies versus the autocracies, and all those things that you were just talking about really signify, the hypocrisy of basically the collective West and how they're carrying out response to this conflict. Claire Daly just did an interview. I think it was with the Duran, or at least Alexander Mercuris was interviewed as a part of this, and it went out on their feed. But Claire Daly she's, for the audience, she's a representative from Ireland to the European Parliament, and she was just talking about how it really seems like in Europe the people really are opposed to the escalations that Europe has wrought. I mean, specifically Great Britain but kind of the collective, America and Great Britain, but Europe as well, and how their economic interests are being undermined, especially with, the resources coming from Russia to Germany and the Eurozone being sabotaged. But it seems like the conversations she's having, people really don't want this escalatory policy. And as she goes around Europe talking to people, the people don't want it. But just like in the United States, it really seems to be driven by, the government without a consensus from the people. And I think she had said that Ireland is the only country in the Eurozone where they have a popular vote on treaty obligations or something like that. And Ireland votes things down all the time, it seems like she had said. So, yeah, you really get that discrepancy between the narrative of democracies versus autocracies.
Yeah, and I've been hearing the same story from some of our folks at Quincy who have traveled to Europe recently. The elites are foursquare for this war in Ukraine and continuing to prolong it, to see the priority as giving weapons and aid over negotiations and diplomacy. But yet there are signs that regular people, like you said, who are suffering from economic despair in many of these countries, are not as sanguine and not as forcefully behind this continued war position. And I have heard that it's actually worse in Europe in terms of trying to find dissenting views, whether it be in their elite institutional think tanks or their media, the mainstream media there. It is a lot more, I want to use the word restrictive in terms of what people can say than even here. And we find the intolerance pretty suffocating here in the United States, but the conformity there in Europe is a lot worse. And so until people really start hitting the streets and protesting en masse, and which, you have seen spurts of this across Europe, mostly over economic issues. But once you see an actual focused anti-war movement there on the streets, it's easy for the media to ignore and to perpetuate this idea of absolute unity in favor of the current status quo policies.
And they've been talking too about, in that interview specifically with Claire Daly, talking about how the Eurozone initially, how it was sold was, well, we've learned the lessons from World War I and World War II. Now we're going to make this political unit that will prevent us from killing each other en masse. But yet it seems like it's just been a vehicle for this neoliberal foreign policy at the behest of the United States or the Anglo-American establishment. And now we're at a point where, we're on the brink of a major theater war with Russia, which, Russia, I guess the major populated areas, I guess you could consider to be in Europe, but the whole point of it we don't learn our lessons at all, essentially, I suppose.
No, and what I find most disturbing about the entire thing is that up until the February invasion, the February 22 invasion of Russia or of Ukraine by Russia, there was a really robust debate about the future of NATO, whether or not the United States needed to be leading the alliance, whether or not European countries, member countries, could start stepping up the burden sharing, and whether or not, like, existentially, was there still a mission for NATO, or was it time, to let it go and create or help to create a new European security architecture there that did not require the United States to be leading it. And then the invasion happened, and this gave impetus to all of those, like you described, neoliberal elites in Europe and in the United States to say, see, NATO is as needed, necessary as ever, and we have to keep not only keep fueling it, but we need to send more troops, build up our positions and our footprint in each of these countries, build up our weapons for the foreseeable future. Because if we don't, Russia is going to remain a threat to the region forever. And this has really set back that really important debate. And I'm afraid that without more people stepping up, whether it's from the left or the right, and mostly these arguments are coming from the right now, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, if Russia is not the maniacal threat that you're saying, it can barely take keep the territory it's gained in a year, much less be able to rampage across other parts of Europe. And if these European countries, France, Germany, Poland, Lithuania, what have you, can start building up their security and be serious about the burden sharing, they'll be okay. And maybe this is what is required for this shift, this transformation to happen. But until there's a real discussion about this, it seems as though the NATOites are able to justify continued growth of that institution, which now we're hearing that they're opening up an office in Tokyo so that NATO can be part of the US containment policy with China and even expanding its mission even further. There has to be some resistance to this, or we're going to see NATO expand even further than it had in the past, which has landed us in the spot we're in now, unfortunately, with Russia.
And it seems like the only real big pushback I've heard about the NATO office being opened in Tokyo was from Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. And he put forward this novel concept that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization maybe should, stay in the North Atlantic. It just seems like common sense to me, but we'll see how long he can, withhold the pressure from putting an office there. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there there. A flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker. Really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/Stitch Fix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So you had mentioned before, there's a couple things I wanted to touch on, conservatism and realism. And at least for me, growing up in kind of a rural area in Wisconsin, being conservative, being raised conservative, and my step-grandfather, he was a tank commander under Patton during World War II. And growing up and venerating him, and really idolizing, and seeing all the war films that we saw, especially Saving Private Ryan came out in '99, I believe, when I was at a very impressionable age. But just having that mythos, I think it's really difficult from that conservative point of view. It's like you're balancing on a knife's edge between exalting the armed services, but at the same time being, for our troops in a way that, well, I'm patriotic, I love America, I want to take care of them, and the best way to do that is to keep them from getting killed and to treat them well for the service that they did do, but yet still having a principled opposition to that war. And so have you found a good way to strike that balance with your activism?
I mean, you've expressed that very eloquently. I think it is a canard that if you question the foreign policy that sends young men and women overseas to fight political wars, Washington's wars, if you resist or dissent from that somehow you're not patriotic, that you don't love your country enough. I would like to see that canard torn down, ripped to shreds, because I think that does separate, or actually sets conservatives against each other when it comes to the critical moment of debating and criticizing the current war policy. And I think that silences a lot of people on the right. I think Trump did everyone a big service in 2016 when he came out in his inaugural foreign policy address at the National Interest while he was candidate Donald Trump, and said that we had to end these endless wars, that Iraq was a failure, that the United States does not have to be the global policeman, that we can take care of our own country, we can maintain a strong defense for when it is necessary, but we shouldn't be going out in search of monsters to destroy, like John Quincy Adams so eloquently said. And I think that opened the door for a lot of folks on the right to say, you know what, I really have a hard time with the global war on terror, where it's gone. It hasn't been a benefit to us. I don't feel any safer. And by the way, all of these young men and women coming from rural areas, southern states, red states, have gone off and sacrificed for the rest of the country. This 0.5% of the population who fought these wars for 20 years. What did we get out of it? And now they come home and their minds are broken, their bodies are broken, their families are broken. And for what? And here was Donald Trump that was giving them permission to feel like that and not be seen as unpatriotic, or against the military. And so I think it really created an opening to say exactly what you said. I love my country and I want to see a strong military and I want to take care of our service members and make sure that we have a strong national defense. But that doesn't mean that I shut my mouth when I see Washington and members of Congress shirking, their responsibility to debate wars and to place a check on executive power when these new war policies are formulated, or they have things like the authorization for the use of military force that's been in place since 2001 that gives the president a blank check to send troops anywhere. I think it's patriotic to criticize that and try to repeal that, like Rand Paul and Mike Lee and other constitutional conservatives have been doing. So I really abhor the idea that conservatives are nervous or silenced from speaking their mind on war issues because they're afraid of being called unpatriotic.
Yeah, and especially when, like you say, a lot of them have given the ultimate sacrifice, or at least have put themselves in that situation. And I think that the work that Defend the Guard is doing too,
Yes.
networking with veterans who are, big tough guys who went out there and did what they need to do, and men and women who have done those things. I think that it's just so valuable to have their support.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I love what they're doing. And I think it only helps our cause when you have military veterans out there at the sort of spear point of this effort at not only questioning the war, but in the Defend the Guard. And in that situation is like, no, it is unconstitutional for these states to send their National Guardsmen to wars that have not been authorized by Congress. And taking a noble stand like that, and so that you have these veterans who are going and testifying in state legislatures, and nobody is going to impugn their credibility as men and women who have actually served. And so we need more veterans out there. I mean, no, veterans aren't a monolith, and I learned that a long time ago as a reporter when I went to talk to. I used to hang out at this American Legion in New Britain, Connecticut, where I was a reporter, and I'd literally be drinking beers at the bar with all these Vietnam veterans because this was years ago. They were all still in their 40s, and and my youthful naivete just assumed that they were all skeptical of the government, all skeptical of wars, and it's just more complicated than that. You find veterans who are like blame Washington for putting them in wars and then sending them home crippled and messed up in the heads. And then others are like, hey, I was proud of my service, and they don't want to hear anymore. And I respect that. I respect that you have veterans who are joined up with Democratic leaning groups, like Vote Vets, for example. And then there are veterans who are like Concerned Veterans of America, which are more conservative, and they have different points of view on how the VA should be reformed, for example, or who's at fault for the lack of trust in the military right now. But that said, I would love to get more veterans who do feel very strongly about realism and restraint and holding the government accountable to write for me at Responsible Statecraft, because I think that they have a genuine voice and an authority to speak on these issues that regular people like me, as passionate as I am, don't have.
And again, I'm glad you mentioned realism towards the end of that, because from at the crossroads where are both our two interests meet. Of course, I'm coming from the antiwar.com, Randolph Bourne Institute, War is the Health of a State kind of perspective, where you could get into Murray Rothbard and the non-aggression principle and all that kind of stuff. Although I try to pick apart the idea of like that there is a just war and there could be a just war, and maybe that's a conversation for another day. but at least in the work, that Justin Raimondo did with reclaiming the American right and trying to find that common lineage of where the libertarian side kind of meets the realism side.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you could you define what you mean when you say realism?
This is quite a thicket that you're asking me to
Sure.
walk
I'm
into.
sorry.
I mean, there's an academic, international IR theory, in terms of the state approaching foreign policy in clearly through the lens of its national interest. That is probably the starkest terminology for it. And then why some people don't like realism is because they say, well, that doesn't take into account, any empathy for the other, human rights and liberties,
Sure.
and all that jazz. I say realism in that I feel like realism does eschew a lot of the emotionally charged American exceptionalism that has driven our foreign policy since World War II. This idea that the United States military could be used to spread democracy and bring liberty and sunlight, to all the dark corners of the earth, as we have seen our government try to pursue. And that is a more neoconservative position. That neoconservative position has dominated US foreign policy consensus thinking since World War II, but especially since the Cold War. The Cold War was really the sort of epitome of this idea of good versus evil, autocracies versus democracies. I feel like Reagan was probably keeping a lid on the more messianic version of that, but we really saw this idea explode after 9/11, and I feel like realism really had taken a back seat to this neoconservative vision, which so fueled by American exceptionalism and, sort of exacerbated the massive failures that we saw in the global war on terror. I feel like we've kind of thumped back down to earth since then. And people like, John Mearsheimer, for example, probably epitomizes the realism where you look at history, you look at the patterns of history, you look at U.S. national interest, and you try to gauge how these dynamics in international relations will roll out, and you kind of see each geopolitical relationship through a lens, and you don't say, well, we have to fight this war because A, domino theory, or B, we need to bring democracy, and we have to, pursue democratic movements and support democratic movements in other countries because that's going to better the world. It's more like that's actually going to make things worse, and us getting into a war might create unintended consequences and being able to see what those consequences are before marching in is a more realistic way of looking at it. Now, I'm obviously not a student of international relations, so I can't articulate this as well as others, but I do feel like we have reached a point, at least in Washington, where you have more people talking like this, as opposed to, the neoconservative predominance in discourse of, say, 10, 20 years ago. Now, there's still people like Nikki Haley running for president, John Bolton's running around there, still espousing, but I feel like they are more on the descent as than they are ascendant in Washington today, thankfully.
And I feel like on the mirror side of that, there is, you talk about American exceptionalism versus that the supercharged neoconservative kind versus the realism restraint kind. At least in the libertarian movement, it seems like there's the libertarian universalists too, who you say the flip side of realism is that people say, well, what about other countries? If you're pursuing your own national interests, we want to promote these American the things that all of our ethos, and um but on the flip side, the libertarian side, it seems like there's also libertarian universalists who don't care about country borders, and that some of them have come on the side of supporting Ukraine because, of course, Ukraine was attacked, and that violates the non-aggression principle, or what have you. But in terms of that, what I've found is being, kind of doing that Justin Raimondo Libertarian Institute antiwar.com, is that we've come to this area where being an idealist in a way, and having like pretty base principles, but trying also to be effective in the real world, where ideally in a libertarian society maybe we wouldn't have nation states in the way they're conceived today, but how do we be effective in the world where nation states do exist and national security interests do exist, at least for now, whatever, and they will exist because that's just the way the world is. It's not going to change the way we would want it to. But it is kind of a difficult balance to, specifically with Taiwan policy. Of course, I would want the United States not to sell any weapons to Taiwan and not be involved at all, but that's just not going to happen, Kelley. So I don't know. I think I don't know exactly if there's a question there, but it's just a thought about how to engage with the forces in Washington in a persuasive, effective way while being principled at the same time.
Right. I mean, the way I look at realism is more on a practical level as opposed to theory. And
Certainly.
I would say that there were some really well-intentioned, thoughtful, smart realists around back in the 90s who had warned against NATO expansion. And they testified in Congress, for example, and they were there. There were voices. They just were crowded out by the voices who said, oh, we have to keep pushing and pushing because Russia is a threat, and we have to protect, these former Warsaw Pact countries, and they saw this more as a democratic project than seeing what could come from it. And so I feel like if the realists had been in charge 30 years ago, we might not be sitting here talking about a Ukraine war and Russia invading, and the idea that perhaps Putin might be pushed to using tactical nuclear weapons at some point. I mean, who would have thought, a few years ago that we would be talking about nuclear Armageddon? And where did it start? And, of course, our side has been excoriated for suggesting that NATO expansion has led to where we are now. But I think that it couldn't be safely argued that the realists had been cast to the side on many different points, whether it be on U.S.-Russia relations, but also in our approach to the Middle East after 9/11. I'm sure plenty of realists, and I remember them, they just weren't getting a lot of ink because they were crowded out by the mainstream media at the time, that were just talking about, listen, we should go after the actors who committed the atrocities on 9/11, Al Qaeda. Let's go find them and do what we got to do, and then get out of there. There are even some realists who have said that we shouldn't have even needed, we didn't even need to go into Afghanistan. We could have let our partners get those Al Qaeda guys and ended it right there. But because our foreign policy had been dominated by these messianic slash neoconservative um, people in Washington, we created a global war on terror over it. And so that's my best explanation. And having written at antiwar.com and being friends with Justin for all those years, I could see it. There is a genuine overlap between, the libertarian anti-war movement, the left anti-war movement, the realists, and everyone in between, the paleocons and whatnot. But I think we would all agree that, the government, the overreach, the ability for Washington to pass laws against its own people via the Patriot Act were something that we could all agree on, that we all needed to fight against. And sometimes some of these, labels and, the partisan aspect of it does to get in the way. And, I don't know too much about the libertarian divide. I have heard about it, and I'd love to talk to you offline on what it all means.
Yeah.
But all I know is the libertarians that I had been friendly with during all those years of the GWAT were very much anti-war, non-interventionists of the antiwar.com stripe. And so it's very interesting to see, the progressives have been very critical of, the Quincy Institute position on Ukraine. A lot of our support is coming from folks on the right now, because progressives have been four square in support of the Biden administration, and very much skeptical of this idea that we should be pushing for a negotiated peace or a ceasefire in Ukraine. So it goes to show, different wars create different, coalitions and bedfellows. And I feel like my principles have been consistent throughout. It's just that I find, different allies as each war, in every intervention.
Yeah, and I hope too I didn't imply that libertarians are the only ones that have principles, because that's certainly not true. And I hope I'm just thinking back on what I had said or how I had framed the question. But I think that in some ways you had mentioned the libertarian divide. I think some of the hubris of libertarians is that we think that our principles are the only principles, and maybe I'm sensitive to that perception elsewhere. But no, I think that that's a quagmire that you probably don't want to get into. But moreover, I think it's not important, and it's not what we should be focused on, because the mission of the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com was this coalition building with people like yourselves across. And that's the most important thing to me. But I want to be respectful of your time too, Kelley. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm really glad to have met you, and hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, I love it. And I really enjoy myself, and I'd like to talk more. I realize that we were probably only scratching the surface.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about China too, but when it's everything everywhere all at once, you got to pick a narrow scope. So
yeah, next time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how can people follow you?
Sure. Okay. So all of my writing right now is at responsiblestatecraft.org, and all of our great writing is on there. And I am also on Twitter at Kelley Vlahos.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Well, you have a great day, and thanks again. This should be up this weekend, I think. So
awesome.